Okay, so have you ever had that feeling where, like, you're interested in something, but you feel like you're only scratching the surface? Like there's this whole other level of understanding if you could just get a little deeper.
Yeah, I know that feeling. It's like you can see there's more, but you just don't know how to get to it.
Exactly. And that's kind of what we try to do here on the deep dive. We take a bunch of different sources. It could be like articles or research papers, even stuff you send us, and we like pull out the really important insights, like the surprising stuff, those moments where you're like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. The stuff that helps you really understand something without having to wade through a ton of information.
So you take us from knowing a little to understanding a lot. That's pretty cool.
Exactly. And you know what? This deep dive today is actually based on some material that you sent our way.
Oh, really? I'm excited to see what we uncover.
Me too. Today, we're going to dive into the world of romantic poetry. We're going to look at where it came from and what ideas made it so important. And to help us on this journey, we're going to be using a YouTube transcript from the Happy Learning channel. It's a lecture called A230A Fall 2024 1303 Tuesday Romantics 1 by Dr. Sam Jall.
Okay, so a college lecture. Seems like a good place to start.
Definitely. And our mission, if you will, is to try and understand the basic principles of the Romantic movement in literature, particularly focusing on poetry, just like in the lecture.
Sounds good to me. Let's unpack this thing.
So what's really interesting is how this lecture starts by talking about Romanticism as a kind of response to what came before it.
Okay. A reaction to earlier trends.
Yeah. Dr. Joel says it popped up around the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th. And he makes this point that in his course, poetry was just one of the genres they were looking at. They're also studying plays by people like Shakespeare and Webster.
Oh, yeah, those big names.
Right. And narrative works, stories, basically, like Voltaire's Candide. But the key is that Romanticism wasn't only a literary thing. This lecture really makes that clear.
Okay, so it's bigger than just books and poems.
Way bigger. It's like this whole cultural shift. Art, philosophy, even politics got caught up in it. And the lecture mentions all that, but we're going to zero in on literature for our deep dive today, specifically poetry.
Right, makes sense. Focus is good.
Totally. Now, before we go any further, we need to clear up something. I'm sure when most people hear romantic poetry, they think of like love and romance.
Yeah, like love poems and flowers and all that mushy stuff.
Uh-huh, exactly. But that's not really what we're talking about here. Dr. Joel explains that in a literary sense, romantic has a different meaning. It's more about embracing the wild side of things, nature, and being free. Think revolution, rebellion, going against the grain. And that wasn't just in their themes, it was in how they actually wrote poetry, too.
So it's like they were breaking the rules, right? Shaking things up.
That's it. And this actually mirrored a bigger shift happening in society at the time. People were starting to question authority, demand more individual freedom. It was a revolutionary time in many ways.
Oh, wow, I never thought about it like that.
It's fascinating, right? So in terms of poetry, the Romantics were pushing back against the rules and expectations that came before them.
So what were the poets doing before the Romantics?
Well, the lecture talks about how there was this rigidity and these strict rules back then, like specific rhyme schemes, meters, that's the rhythm of the lines, and even limitations on what topics were okay to write about.
Poets had to stay inside those lines.
Pretty much. But the Romantics, they felt stifled by all that. They wanted poetry to be freer. They wanted to challenge the status quo.
So they wanted to break free from all those restrictions.
Exactly. It was like they were saying, hey, there's more to poetry than just following the old rules. It's like those poets before them were expected to be these perfect mirrors, reflecting reality exactly as it was, no more, no less. The lecture mentions this idea of the poet holding a mirror to nature.
Ah, interesting analogy. So how did the Romantics change that?
Well, they basically said, hold on, there's more to it than just copying what's already there. They wanted to explore the depths of human experience, look at the parts of life that really make us tick, the things that positively influence us.
They wanted to go deeper, beyond the surface.
Precisely. And this is where their love of nature comes in. They saw nature, especially the countryside, as a source of wisdom and purity.
So not just pretty scenery, but like a teacher.
Exactly, untouched by human corruption. In the lecture, there's this contrast made between a wild jungle and a perfectly manicured garden.
I bet they preferred the jungle.
You got it! It represented this untamed freedom. So to sum it up, The Romantic movement was all about challenging traditions, saying screw the rules, celebrating the individual, glorifying nature, and valuing imagination above all else.
They were like the rebels of the poetry world. I like it.
They totally were. And there's another interesting thing. The way they viewed the poet also changed.
Oh, how so?
They weren't just seen as skilled technicians following a set of rules. They were almost like visionaries, prophets even, who could inspire change and reform society through their art.
Wow, that's a huge step up.
I know, right? So we've talked about the why behind Romanticism. Now let's get into the what. What did this new perspective actually mean for poetry itself?
Yeah, good question. How did it change the poems themselves?
That's what the lecture tackles next. It starts by acknowledging that, hey, you, dear listener, probably have some experience with poetry already.
I mean, most of us have encountered it at some point, right?
Of course. And in the lecture, the students give some typical definitions, like it expresses feelings and emotions, or it has rhyme and style.
Those are pretty common associations, right?
Yeah, and the lecture points out those are partly true. But for instance, while poetry can express feelings, other forms of writing can too.
So what really sets poetry apart?
Rhyme. That's the big one. And the lecture goes on to explain exactly what rhyme is.
Okay, I'm all ears. Break it down for us.
Basically, it's when you have the same or very similar sounds at the ends of lines in a poem. And these rhyming lines can be arranged in different patterns, sometimes right next to each other, sometimes alternating. And it adds to the musicality of the poem.
Ah, like the beat in music.
Yeah, you got it. It gives it that sing-song quality. And speaking of music, there's also this thing called meter and rhythm.
Right, so it's not just the rhyme, but also the rhythm of the words.
Exactly. Meter is like the underlying beat. It's a pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables in each line.
Got it. So those are the sound elements. What about the visual side of poetry?
That's another interesting point. You can often tell something's a poem just by looking at it on the page.
How so?
Well, poems usually have shorter lines, and they don't go all the way across the page like regular writing does.
Oh, that makes sense. So the way it looks is a clue.
Yeah, like a visual signal. And then there's this really crucial element called imagery.
Imagery, what's that all about?
It's how poets use words to create vivid images in your mind. It's like they're painting a picture with words.
Ah, so they're engaging our senses, like
Yeah.
making us see, hear, or even smell things in our minds.
Exactly. And the lecture really stresses that all these things rhyme, rhythm, imagery. They're not just there to look pretty.
They actually have a purpose.
Right. They all contribute to the meaning of the poem. They're deliberate choices made by the poet to achieve a specific effect.
Interesting. So it's not just about sounding pretty.
Nope. Every element serves a purpose. Oh, and the lecture also brings up the idea of poetry being intellectual, which might seem surprising given the emphasis on feelings.
Wait, intellectual, how does that fit in?
Well, the lecture explains that poetry often makes you think because poets play with language. Sometimes they twist words around or put them in unexpected places, and you got to work a little to figure out what they really mean.
Ah, so it's not always surface level. There are deeper layers of meaning to uncover.
Precisely. And often there's a whole philosophy underlying the poem. It's like the poet is exploring big ideas about the world. And it's not just about intellectual satisfaction either. Poetry has this amazing power to make us feel things deeply and transport us to different places or times.
That's the beauty of it, right? It
Yeah.
speaks to both our minds and our hearts.
Absolutely. The lecture even mentions all sorts of different poetry forms. Heroic epics, lyrical poems, sad elegies, philosophical poems, allegories, and of course love poems. It's a diverse world.
And all of that falls under the umbrella of poetry. It's pretty remarkable.
And to really hammer home this visual aspect we talked about, the lecture actually shows some examples, just blocks of text, and asks the students which ones are poems.
I bet they could tell just by looking.
Yeah, they totally could. The poems just stand out. Shorter lines, irregular shapes. It's like you instinctively know.
Intuition, eh?
Eh.
So, we talked about how to recognize a poem, but what actually makes a poem? What are the key ingredients?
Okay, so the lecture goes through a bunch of these ingredients. One of the first ones is diction. That's basically just a fancy word for the words the poet chooses to use.
Word choice. Makes sense.
Yeah.
So how is diction different in Romantic poetry?
Well, earlier poets often used really fancy, elevated language, the kind of stuff you wouldn't use in everyday conversation. But the Romantics, they preferred simpler language. They wanted their poetry to be accessible to everyone, not just a select few.
Ah, so they were bringing poetry down to earth a bit.
Exactly. And then we have all the sound devices, rhyme and rhythm we talked about, but also things like alliteration. That's where you repeat the same sound at the beginning of words.
Okay, so like Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. That's alliteration, right?
Perfect example. The lecture gives another one. Whether will the wonder way fairer? Hear that repetition of the W sound.
Oh yeah, it creates a kind of flow, almost like a little song.
Right. And then there's assonance, which is repeating vowel sounds. Think of the phrase, the rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain.
Ah, I see, all those A sounds.
Exactly. And then there's onomatopoeia, which are words that imitate sounds, like buzz, crash, meow.
Those are fun words. So they add a little sound effect to the poem.
Yep. And then we move on to figurative language. This is where things get really interesting. We have metaphors, which compare things directly without using like or as.
Oh, so like saying someone has a heart of gold is a metaphor.
Exactly. Then there are similes, which do use like or as to compare things. For example, he was as strong as an ox.
Makes sense. So what about personification? I remember that one from school.
Ah, personification. That's where you give human qualities to things that aren't human. For example, the wind whispered secrets through the trees.
Oh yeah, like the wind is a person whispering.
You got it. And the lecture really emphasizes that all these elements, diction, sound devices, figurative language, they all work together to create the poem's meaning.
So it's like a symphony with all these different instruments playing together.
That's a great way to put it. Okay, so we've got a good grasp of what Romanticism was pushing back against, what its core values were, and the building blocks of poetry itself. Now, let's dive into the heart of the matter, the emergence of this romantic revolution.
The moment it all kicked off, I'm ready.
So the lecture really drives home this idea of Romanticism as a huge shift in thinking about poetry. They wanted to create something that truly touched the human soul, a move away from what they saw as the overly formal, almost mechanical approach of the Augustan age.
The Augustan age, what was that all about?
It was this period in the early 18th century that was all about reason, order, and logic, kind of like a more buttoned-up version of the Enlightenment.
Okay, so the Romantics were rebelling against that.
Exactly. They're like, enough with the order and calm. Let's get messy.
Haha, love it. But what exactly did they replace it with?
Yeah.
What were the key elements of this shift?
Okay, so the lecture lays out these key characteristics. They rejected the 18th century's love of order, calm, harmony, balance, and rationality. They were done with the Age of Enlightenment's obsession with reason.
So if it wasn't about reason, what was it about?
It became all about the individual, subjective experiences, the irrational parts of us. They embraced imagination, personal feelings, spontaneity, emotion, a visionary way of seeing things, even transcendental ideas.
Transcendental, what does that even mean?
That's a good question. It basically refers to this idea of going beyond the ordinary human experience and reaching a higher level of understanding, like tapping into spiritual truths, often through nature and intuition.
Interesting. So a shift from logic and reason to feelings and intuition.
You got it. And nature, as we mentioned, was a huge part of this.
Right, they saw nature as a source of wisdom.
Exactly. They believed that nature, especially the countryside, was pure, untouched by human corruption. They valued emotion over reason, experiencing the world through senses rather than just thinking about it.
Feeling over thinking.
Yes. And they were all about exploring the individual personalities, those fleeting moods, and the complex inner workings of the human mind.
So it was about looking inward, not just outward.
Exactly. And this had a big impact on how they portrayed poets and poetic figures. They became these intense characters, often struggling with inner conflicts and passions.
That's a far cry from just being skilled technicians following rules.
Right. The Romantics saw the poet as a genius with a unique creative spirit. They valued the act of creation itself more than just following preset rules. And imagination, oh man, imagination was everything to them.
So they elevated the role of the poet.
Totally. The poet was no longer just a craftsman. And imagination became the key to unlocking those deeper truths and transcendental experiences. It was almost like magic to them.
They embraced the power of imagination.
Cool. So what else did they focus on?
Well, they were also drawn to subjects that hadn't been considered poetic before. Things like folklore and the stories of ordinary people. They loved the exotic, the mysterious, the weird, even the spooky stuff. So they broadened the scope of what poetry could be about.
Exactly. They weren't afraid to explore the dark side, even the monstrous or satanic. It was a real expansion of the poetic landscape.
So when did all this actually start to take off? Was there a specific moment when Romanticism burst onto the scene?
The lecture pinpoints the late 18th, early 19th century, and there's this key publication, Lyrical Ballads.
Ah, a game changer. And who are the masterminds behind this landmark publication?
That would be William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. They're like the poster boys for the first generation of Romantic poets. And the lecture also mentions William Blake as a kind of pre-Romantic figure. He was laying the groundwork for what was to come.
A pioneer, huh? So what did they actually say about poetry? What was their definition?
Oh, they had this really famous line in the preface to Lyrical Ballads, the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings.
So simple, yet so powerful. That really sums up their whole approach.
It does, right. And then, of course, we can't forget the second wave of Romantic poets who came after them, people like John Keats, Lord Byron, and Percy Bysshe Shelley.
Right, they took the torch and ran with it.
Totally. But for our deep dive today, the lecture focuses on William Wordsworth, especially his role as the poet of nature.
The poet of nature. That sounds about right. What did nature mean to him, exactly?
The lecture is really clear about this. Nature for Wordsworth meant the countryside. Mountains, lakes, trees, all of that. And the lecture makes this interesting connection to our modern lives.
Oh, how so?
Well, it uses this Arabic word, da, which describes that feeling of wanting to escape to the countryside, like getting fresh air, peace, and quiet away from the city. It's something that resonates with people even today.
Totally, like a universal longing for nature.
Exactly. And the lecture explains how Wordsworth moved to this beautiful area called the Lake District. He thought the people who lived there, the farmers and rural folk, had this innocence and purity because they were so close to nature.
So he romanticized country life a bit.
Maybe a little. And his home in the Lake District, Dove Cottage, is now a museum. People visit to experience the environment that inspired so much of his poetry.
I can see why. It's like stepping into his creative world.
Right. So we've talked a lot about the theory behind Romanticism. Now let's see how it all comes together in practice. The lecture moves on to analyzing a specific poem by Wordsworth to really see these romantic ideals in action.
Time for a case study. Which poem did they choose?
One of his most famous, I wandered lonely as a cloud. And just like with the students in the lecture, let's see if you can figure out if it's romantic just by looking at it.
Okay, challenge accepted.
So, first of all, is it a poem?
Well, it's definitely not written like normal text, those shorter lines, different lengths.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say it's a poem.
You got it. And what about the romantic part?
Well, it talks about clouds, daffodils, and being deeply moved by nature. Sounds pretty romantic to me.
Exactly. The lecture points out all those natural elements. Clouds, valleys, hills, trees, daffodils, waves, stars.
And they're all described so vividly, you can practically feel the breeze and smell the flowers.
I know, right? And how do all these elements make you, as the reader, feel?
I'd say happy, peaceful, maybe even a bit inspired.
Bingo. So let's break down that opening line. I wandered lonely as a cloud. Wandered means he was just moving around without a specific destination. Lonely meaning he was by himself. And the comparison to a cloud.
Gives a sense of freedom, like he's floating along carefree.
Exactly. And that solitude, the lecture points out, is actually a key part of Romanticism. It's not about being sad and alone. It's about being alone with your thoughts and with nature.
So it's like solitude for inspiration.
That's it. And then he describes coming across this field of daffodils by a lake. Under the trees, they're fluttering and dancing in the breeze.
Such a beautiful image.
Right. And the lecture talks about how the poem then moves to the last stanza where the poet's back home lying on his couch. But the memory of those daffodils pops up in his mind. And that memory brings him joy and ultimately leads to poetic inspiration.
So it's like the experience in nature is just the first step. Then he needs that time for quiet reflection to turn it into art.
You got it. And the lecture points out how this is typical of Romantic poetry. Seeking solitude in nature for inspiration, then reflecting on it in solitude to create.
Fascinating. And what about the language Wordsworth uses in this poem?
Well, the lecture highlights how simple and direct it is. No fancy words or complicated structures, just straightforward language, which fits perfectly with the Romantic ideal of making poetry accessible to everyone.
Right, they wanted to connect with ordinary people. And what about the rhyme and rhythm?
Well, the lines aren't super long, and there is rhyme, but it's not a strict pattern. The lecture points out examples like glee and tree or lake and shake.
Subtle but effective.
Exactly. And overall, this poem is what's called a lyrical poem. That means it expresses a single mood or moment of consciousness. And in this case, the speaker is the poet himself, reflecting on his experience.
So it's a personal and intimate look at a specific encounter with nature.
Exactly. And the lecture nicely breaks down the poem into three stages. First, describing the experience, then reacting to it emotionally, and finally, how that memory lingers and impacts his mind.
A three-act play in poem form.
I like that analogy. And at its core, the poem is about how experiencing beauty in nature can affect us deeply and inspire us long after the actual experience is over.
It's about carrying that feeling with you.
Yes, but now, get this. The lecture throws in a little twist. It turns out Wordsworth might not have actually been alone during this whole daffodil experience.
What? I know, right?
The lecture brings in some biographical context, mentioning Wordsworth's sister, Dorothy. Apparently, she wrote about the same experience in her diary.
Oh, wow. So he wasn't wandering lonely after all.
Maybe not. And this is where things get really interesting. The poem focuses on this solitary experience, but the reality might have been quite different.
That's a big discrepancy. Why do you think he chose to portray it as a solo adventure?
Well, the lecture suggests a few reasons. First, Wordsworth was trying to build this image of himself as a lone genius, inspired by nature. You know, the classic romantic poet.
Ah, so as part of his artistic persona.
Exactly. And Dorothy, writing in her private journal, didn't have that same public image to worry about. Plus, remember, women writers faced a lot more restrictions back then.
Right, it was a different world for women writers.
Totally. And from a purely artistic standpoint, maybe Wordsworth thought focusing on the individual experience made for a stronger poem, emphasizing that solitude and connection with nature.
Interesting. So it could be a mix of personal image, societal pressures, and artistic choices all coming together.
Exactly. And get this, Wordsworth actually used Dorothy's journals later on when he was revising his poems, so their experiences were definitely intertwined.
Wow. Talk about a collaborative creative process, even if it wasn't intentional at first.
Right. It really makes you think about how memory and creativity work together, and how the act of writing or creating art can shape how we remember things.
That's a deep thought.
It is. So, to sum up this awesome deep dive, we've journeyed through the birth of Romantic poetry and its core principles. Valuing nature, emotion, and imagination above the rigid rules of the past, we learned what makes poetry unique and how the Romantics made it more accessible and focused on individual experience. And we took a close look at I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, not just as a pretty poem about nature, but through the lens of this lecture and some interesting biographical details.
Yeah, we went from surface level to deep understanding.
Yeah.
Mission accomplished.
You got it. And if all this talk about Romantic poetry has you curious, I highly recommend checking out more of Wordsworth's work and other Romantic poets too. There's a whole world of powerful emotions and boundless imagination waiting for you.
And it all connects back to you, dear listener.
Mm.
Think about your own experiences with nature. Do you ever feel that sense of wonder and inspiration that Wordsworth describes? And do you ever think about how your own memories might be shaped by the stories you tell yourself or the art you create?
Those are great questions to ponder.
They are. And as always, we encourage you to join us for future deep dives. We love exploring new topics and helping you gain a deeper understanding of the world around you. So keep those sources coming. Until next time, happy learning.
And happy diving!